Hello and welcome to the Engerati studio here at Itron Utility Week. And I'm now joined by Gordon Feller, who's the co-founder of Meeting of the Minds. And we're going to be talking a little bit around smart cities. It's a massive, massive theme here at the event. A lot of Itron energy is going into figuring out how the energy sector plays within the smart city ecosystem, and there's a lot of work that's been done on many a pilot. But Gordon, first off, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
And give us a little bit of background on the work you've been doing, and then we can dive into some of the thoughts we're having around the breaking down of silos and what actually needs to happen within smart cities. But if you just give us a little bit of context of where your answers are coming from your work at Meeting of the Minds.
Sure. Yeah. It goes back to my arrival in Silicon Valley in 1983, which is almost prehistory. It seems like centuries ago, but it's just a few decades. And that was the time when TCP/IP was really first emerging as a viable instrument for connecting disparate objects, but mostly people. And of course, it was sponsored by a group of organizations, but it was led by creative individuals who were often not officially designated as internet pioneers by anybody. They self-selected, and they were often people in the counterculture. And I learned a lot during those years, and that applied to the problems of cities very fast, which is how do you get common, open, secure standards developed, which of course took decades. We're only now arriving at that point in time. And I've been preoccupied really since 1983 with this problem of marrying the technology's power with the kinds of problems that cities face, which are very mundane. How to decongest traffic, how to clean the air to reduce pollutants, how to increase the availability of traffic and transit solutions for people maybe on the edges of a city. All those kinds of problems that cities grapple with every day should be and could be amenable to change when technology is applied. Easier said than done. And that's been my sort of operating premise, is that you need to get a lot of players at the table. They need to learn to play well together in a common sandbox. Ideally, the sandbox should be built by some trusted parties who are neutral to at least some of the actors.
It feels like we've had a parallel career, because I remember when this concept first started, and we called it digital cities. I think it was, and then
and the Brits were very active in this space, and that's why Future Cities Catapult got funded as well as it did.
Exactly, and we also a lot of that conversation was initially around connectivity and wires and things like that, and then it started broadening out. So if we fast forward now to a space where you've even got an ISO standard on what your smart city, those KPIs and so on. One of the things that you wrote about in one of your blogs, I can't remember where it was, but is this notion of breaking down silos, that we need to start looking at this as a more holistic thing. So let me frame my first question, because at the moment I'm just rambling, but here's where I'm trying to get to. Right, this idea of going to someone and saying, hey, you need to break down all your silos, and it can be somewhat of a mind-blowing concept for a city. So tell us a little bit how you go about it, how you explain it, and where the starting point needs to be.
Well, always the starting point is about the nature of data. That data wants to be free. It doesn't want to be trapped in any special silo, that the data has relevancy across the full spectrum. Itron is the perfect example. It's technology that captures the value of data and the flow of natural resources, gas, water, electric. Those are often three different utilities who need what they think are radically different solutions because they believe their businesses are very different. Fundamentally, what we're doing is we're checking it, monitoring, and then managing the flows through the pipes or the wires. And this is something which, utilities have now discovered, the way that retailers have now discovered, the way that financial institutions, and of course how city governments are now beginning to operate, which is to share data across organizational boundaries, effectively not trying to undo decades or centuries of institutional silo building, because you're in a city of London, you know, the London Transit, TfL, has been in the business of supplying transport for literally hundreds of years and doesn't really want to break down its silo with the city treasury. They see this as two organizations that coexist but have separate data sets, and breaking that down institutionally and culturally is hard. So what we encourage and are seeing successfully done in cities is where the data is analyzed across the different organizations in a way that's actionable, because big data has to be translated to little insights that are actionable by machines. Maybe it's a smart meter or a human, maybe it's a bus driver or a taxi driver or a driver of Uber or Lyft. So the idea is empower with insight and make the data invisible.
So this is the notion of, I mean, you mentioned TfL, the open data movement, that they sort of said, listen, we're not going to sit here and build an app about when the tube's coming, but we'll make the data available and you can innovate.
And third parties will show up, which they do almost religiously, either a young team of high schoolers who are not even in college yet, who decide, wow, we can take bus arrival data and turn it into something useful as a class project or just because we're doing it in our garage. And lo and behold, cities report amazing things coming from third parties who, because they have access to the open data sets, discover the insights that then can be translated into a viable commercial product, or maybe it's a giveaway product. And that's happened in countless numbers of cities, and it's saving lives, literally saving lives.
So let's go to the energy sector, where we are. We've got the whole plethora of use cases in transport, and like in New York, the pothole app and all that sort of stuff. But I would argue, considering its importance, pretty precious few from the energy sector. So why do you think that is?
Well, look, I mean, the reality of the economics of the business is that utilities are in the business of selling you more gas, more water, more electric. Their business model was financed on the premise that they would grow in volume of sales of unit. Now, because of where we are on planet Earth, we are all looking for efficiencies. So as that happens, and as that becomes essentially the center of a new business model where utilities can thrive as we all become more efficient, sending those signals backwards and forwards to and from the customer on premises in a way that's actionable, that says, pricing now signal says, don't shower, don't do the wash, don't wash the car, don't do the lawn. These are signals that are now in the transactive energy model going to be much more important if we reward utilities the way they should be rewarded. And the financial institutions are moving in this direction, the regulatory institutions are moving in this direction. Eventually the customer will see that they're being rewarded for the right behavior, but it takes a while because we're dealing with old, heavy institutions called utilities, old, heavy institutions called regulators, and frankly distracted consumers who are trying to manage their lives and keep their head above water.
And in your view then, where are we in that journey? Because I spent a lot of time commentating on the open data movement. Spent a fair amount of time looking at what's happening with transport and everything, and that moved reasonably rapidly. I would say that it was like a 5-year sort of transition into people understanding the value of that. Where are we within energy? Is it going to be slower? Is it going to move at that sort of scale? Because we've been talking for a long time about that.
This question came up very forcefully in the early days of the Trump administration after the new Secretary of Energy was approved and confirmed by the Congress. Governor Perry from the state we're sitting in, Texas, transitioned to being Secretary of Energy, and I'm on the advisory board that makes, 20 of us, 2 from Silicon Valley and the rest from other places. And this was the question, are we at the tipping point? Are we at that takeoff point yet with smart grid infrastructure? Is there a critical mass of deployed meters? Do we have the necessary AMI infrastructure? Is the grid capable of handling the kinds of pressures that electric vehicles are going to impose? We came to the conclusion, with the help of a lot of staff work behind us, that we are at that point right now, which is to some extent what makes the Itron announcement about the Silver Spring acquisition that much more timely, because here you have the combining of businesses that have been focused both on this problem from different angles in some cases. And it's probably the best time for this, because even though the White House is completely out to lunch on the importance of energy efficiency and renewables and smart grid investment, there are still a lot of people in the 50 states, regulators, investors, insurers, and the utilities themselves, who are really, really focused on this, and they're not going to change their focus.
Do you not think that the boat has kind of sailed on that one anyway, because the cost of renewables is coming down?
Absolutely.
So it's like
Absolutely. And by the way, the cost of everything. So the cost of sensors, the cost of compute, the cost of storage, the cost of connectivity, all these things are moving to zero. And as that happens, lots of plates will shift, lots of tectonic plates will shift under the economy, and this will take some time.
So let's go to value, which is one of the things that we always talk about on our network. Is with technology we can do everything, and I remember there was a pilot in a Dutch island where they actually connected everybody up, and they did all the washing machine scenario, and they very quickly realized that actually, mum wants to take the kid to school and the washing's still wet and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose what I'm saying is
it gets messy.
It gets messy. With technology, we can do everything, but what's the real societal value? And I know that you're working on with the Urbanova project, which is really, and we're talking to those folk later, but it really struck me when I got my briefing on it, that is a use case where a utility is really changing itself from saying, hey, not only are we an energy company, we are a citizen and infrastructure provider. Is that the way this needs to be thought about?
Yes, because we're going to have to turn essentially the pyramid on its head and say, who's the most important actor in the equation? It used to be the power producer, and sometimes the transmission and distribution owner, and increasingly, of course, the data provider is now vital, because the utility needs to know, where the power is and where it's being consumed and when and by whom. But ultimately, we've gotten to the point where we should have gotten at the beginning, which is you, the end user, needs to have the tools necessary to participate in making the system more efficient, which means data as needed, in real time, offering up the evidence that says, if I behave differently, my price point will change, my responsibility as a citizen, I'll be able to realize some of that value, and my community is going to prosper, because the way I'm defining sustainability is not just my personal financial sustainability and my community's economic sustainability, but it's also the environmental and social benefits. And those are now being monetized by a whole new world of investors who are essentially considering triple bottom line to be all three bottom lines, the financial, the environmental, and the social, as just as important as any of the others. And as those investors accumulate hundreds of billions of dollars to invest, the utilities that do act in that way are going to be rewarded. The communities that adopt those principles are already being rewarded. And the question is, can we act fast enough given the pace of climate change?
And in your mind, how... Because I talked to quite a lot of utilities, and in the US, different areas have different regulatory environments and so on. So let's try and broad brush this if we can for a second. I mean, how close do you think the utility industry is, in your mind, when it comes to the whole smart city movement, that if it does not engage with this, it will be a loser in the whole thing? I mean, can you make that real for people who are watching?
Well, I mean, there's three ways that you would measure it, and I'm thinking about National Grid, not just in the UK, but in the northeastern part of the US where National Grid operates. But I'm also thinking of Avista and what they're doing in the northwestern part of the US as two examples who've adopted this. They have basically said to the investor community, if you guys take this seriously, we want to be measured against those metrics. So that's one way that this is being realized. The full potential of what we have talked about for a long time is finally coming to pass, that investors are now rewarding utilities to make those choices, and consumers are now opting in where they have that option, because in some places there's what we call in the United States community choice aggregation, where you can effectively opt out of an old utility and opt into a new utility without changing any of the mechanisms. And CCA is now a growing movement precisely because of this. So you've got choices being made by the utility, gets rewarded by investor, choices by consumer that shows up, in where you buy and what you buy, and also sometimes how you buy. And then there's the regulator, who's in many cases, not all of them, in many cases in the US, they're basically saying, we want to incentivize the utility to do this. We will look differently at your rate case, which is where the rubber hits the road. When you make a decision to invest in new technology or in renewables, we're going to look to you and to this opportunity, as a moment to be captured, not a moment to be lost. And so the California PUC has been at the lead in this, but they're not the only one. And it's actually producing results at all three levels. Now, having three pressures like that, it adds significant volume, where if you only had one, it might be ignorable. Maybe two, you feel the pressure. Three, I'm feeling myself as I'm looking at the different utilities and how they're responding. It's hard for them to ignore it at all.
So I realize we're dancing around a fairly complex subject, and there are all manner of things that collide in it and come together. But in terms of bringing it all to a close, then you've clearly articulated that when those three things come together, there is a value that's being created for the utility, especially when the investor community line up behind that. Now, tell me this: what's the value for the city? What's the value for the municipality in terms of getting behind this and making it happen? What are they getting out of this?
Well, let's take a look at Urbanova in Spokane, Washington. So you have the city, Meeting of the Minds, Avista, the utility, Itron, Washington State University. Those are the primaries. And they're all on the board, and they're all guiding the investments that we make as a nonprofit organization. And the idea was, first and foremost, low-hanging fruit. We had to look at the public health challenges for a city that has a pretty significant challenge during fire season. Because there are lots of air quality problems. So the very first move in the university district, 700 plus acres, was to deploy sensors that would be essentially an early warning system to reduce the number of visits to the emergency room, which the city partly pays for. And to say nothing of lost productivity, lost time in school, lost time at work, the cost of getting people to a hospital, all of those associated costs that are hidden. Those could be reduced significantly if we knew in advance when those air quality events were going to take place. And so this is a value to the city right on the bottom line. It will get some politicians reelected maybe. It will get some citizens re-engaged with their government because they see value coming from their government. They may not realize the nonprofit organization organized it. What they're doing is getting an alert from the public health department of the city government. So everybody's winning in this case. Now, on those same poles, those utility poles, which we take as kind of the primary real estate of the smart city, we're going to place lots of other sensors. And the sensor revolution is really making it possible to do that relatively inexpensively. The hard part is getting a team of data scientists together who Amazon would like to hire every one of them if Microsoft and Google don't. So we're competing to some extent with wealthy companies who frankly are not terribly engaged in the air quality problem in Spokane. They are interested in global climate change, they are interested in smart cities. They're not yet engaged specifically with Spokane's air quality problem. So we have to go to Washington State University School of Engineering, School of Medicine, and some third parties and say, here's our raw data, streaming in real time off of these polls. Could you please help us create an emergency alert system and also do ongoing analysis? So there's where we kind of showed the value right away. We didn't ditz around with smart outdoor streetlights for their own sake, or smart street furniture, or smart whatever. We just went to something that would have an immediate benefit to citizens, to governments, to healthcare providers. The insurers actually love it because their insured healthcare customer is less in the hospital.
So would you say that that is one of the key messages to any city going back? Try and find the use case that gives you that immediate return.
And there's a dozen low-hanging fruit opportunities in every city. Not all of them are the same. And our message is, if you need help, contact Meeting of the Minds. We see a lot of cities making their efforts in this domain. We're writing about it every day, and we're working with cities every day. If they want some input from a neutral party, we're a nonprofit, we'll give them some advice, and it'll be vendor neutral. We're not going to push them in the direction of one particular vendor or another. We're going to try to give them an honest, unvarnished assessment. And sometimes our assessment is, this is going to be more costly than you probably realize. And we have to take those as they come.
Gordon, on that note, we'll leave it because I'm getting all sorts of signals to say we've already done what we set out to do. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for watching this Engerati interview here at Itron Utility Week. Thanks for tuning in.